All right, here we are, back in the Shadow Gallery. No better place to be, I like to say. We've got all kinds of comic books. We've got a whole row of video game machines. You've got GameCube all the way down to the regular NES. So people should come by the shop. I'm here today with the author of Barb, Solomon Clark.
Hello. How's it going?
Well, I'm doing good.
Yeah.
I'm really excited to talk to you because I've read your book. I want to know a little bit about where you got the idea and like what germinated this whole project that you've started.
Well, I've been interested in working on comics for a long time, and I've had probably, half a dozen different projects that I've started that haven't gotten to actually get published. I've worked on it and it fell apart for one reason or the other. And a big part of it is that trying to complete a project like a comic is so much work. And really, for an inexperienced writer, for an inexperienced artist, really just scaling back the scope of everything, I think was the first thing that I was thinking about when I was working on this project. And I actually wrote the story for this while I had writer's block for another story I was working on, and I wanted to just write something that was really, not that it's not complex, but something that has a smaller scope than a lot of the other stuff I've been working on. And then, I started writing it, and it was just over the course of like 2 or 3 days that the story just kind of naturally wrote itself, and it was something that I was really happy with. And so that kind of led into this project, and that's where things went. So that's how it started, basically.
Can you kind of take us back to like that initial spark? Was it the world? Was it the theme, or was it the characters that came to your mind first?
So I'm definitely a big sci-fi fan, and the sort of like writing prompt that I did, that was almost like one of those when you're in like a creative writing class and you're supposed to write a 3-page paper on some writing prompt, was basically just do a sci-fi action story with a female protagonist. And one of the things that I think a lot of people criticize about female protagonists in modern media is that they're just a cardboard cutout. Like, they could be swapped out with any other person. You could swap out the character from the new Star Wars with like Sylvester Stallone, and there would be no one would notice a difference in terms of like how they behave in situations. And so what I wanted to do was create a story where it's kind of like female protagonist story, but what would that actually be like in the real world, kind of a thing, and tell that story in a more true to life way, I guess, was the idea.
Was she Barb from the very beginning, or did the name kind of evolve? Or?
A lot of things when I was writing the story kind of just like came together like that, like when you're on a roll creatively and things just kind of start falling into place. And so the name is actually a parody of Barbarella, the 1960s.
Oh, love that film.
It's a great movie, but it definitely is. It's a great movie, but it's kind of like the inverse of the type of story that this one is. So that's kind of it's a reference to that character. That Barb is kind of like a opposite type of action hero character from Barbarella.
Okay.
And also, the name, it sounds like a sharp. It's a little bit of a coarse name.
It literally sounds sharp.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, while I've got you here and you're telling me about that, I'm tempted to ask you about what first got you interested in comics, but maybe I should steer that towards the art. Like, what steers you towards becoming an artist? So you've talked about the writing side, so tell me a little bit more about the art.
Well, I've been drawing, for as long as I can remember. So it was really, and I like telling stories, and when I would do a painting, I would like to have a story be in the painting. Like, you could see, there's these characters and this thing's going on. But I really liked storytelling too, and I was actually looking at getting into film. But film is just so expensive. You can spend $15,000 on a 15-minute short, and it's still probably not going to look very good. But with comics, it's it's the only limitation is your drawing skill, your writing skill, and your amount of time that you have to do it. So whereas this is something I could totally not do on the budget that I have. It is something that I can do as a comic book.
And so we could take a look inside and show some of the viewers the artwork. Tell us about that side of the creative process.
What kind of questions do you have for like the art style? I guess one thing.
Well, we're all looking at this for the first time, so tell us the types of materials you use and what's your process. How do you go from concept to completed page?
Gotcha. So since we've been talking about storytelling, I'd say the first thing that I try to do compositionally is I try to look at it like I try to frame everything the same way that you would shots in a movie. So I try to have basically one panel for each shot. One thing that I is my pet peeve that I see in comic books is when it's just 9 frames with people's heads and a word bubble, and you have no idea where they are in relation to each other, like what's going on. So I really try and frame it out like a movie. And then the other thing that I try to do is, with a comic book, you have you don't have motion and you don't have actors delivering dialogue. So what I try to do to play into those are the weaknesses of or the limitations of the comic book medium. So what I try to do is convey as much motion as I can with the characters' poses and the framing of the shot to convey kind of like what's going on. And then I also try to put as much like complex expressions on the people's faces as I can to try and convey like the nuance that you don't necessarily get with just the text and the page, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And then in terms of the technical of what the paintings are, it's basically a watercolor painting. They're technically inks, so they're not watercolors. They're already pigment-based inks. Mm-hmm. But basically, I pencil it out on a watercolor pad, and then go over that with pen, and then go over that with watercolor, and then I take that into Photoshop, and I kind of do a little bit of touch-up work and put in the bars around the pages, frame it out, and then lay it out and print it. Excellent.
So let's shift gears and talk about the original art that you're going to have up for sale. So we're going to be doing a joint show. It's going to be 3 artists. It's going to be Solomon Clark, Mungo, and Harley, who you guys know from the Shadow Gallery, and we're all going to have our artwork on display. You are actually going to be offering all of the original artwork for the first 3 issues?
Yeah, so if you are a fan of Barb, Mother of Vengeance, you can buy the original watercolor paintings that make up all of those pages. And that's, really that's just a way to be able to cover my printing costs and kind of keep the ball rolling. Because,
Gotcha.
you know how it is with trying to do these things. I'm not making money here, so
yeah.
So I think that's really exciting, and also just to kind of give people a look behind the scenes a little bit and see like what the original paintings look like and how that process works.
And so tell us about the scale. These are full-sized.
So
original watercolor paintings.
All of these paintings are on a 12 by 18 sheet of paper, and then I take that and scan it, and then take the scan is then a JPEG, and then you put it in and do the layout. So these are about twice the size of the finished book.
Okay. The fact of the matter is, original comic book art is really coveted by collectors, mm-hmm. and I think this is a really cool opportunity that you're giving people a chance to pick up some original work.
Yeah, I was the first show that I did on the road on the circuit was actually the San Francisco Comic Art Show. Mm-hmm. So that was interesting because it was sort of like a Comic Con for comic art collectors, and I was the only original artist there. So, that was a lot of people. It was a lot of like Marvel and DC stuff, and it was actually interesting because I kind of found that a lot of people didn't know how to approach it the same way, because my work's kind of closer to the different style of comics than what you see in like Marvel DC world.
You mentioned like the French heavy metal aesthetic, like
so
classic
in Europe in the 70s and 80s was kind of like the heyday of it. There was a magazine called Heavy Metal, and that was a lot of European indie comics, basically. And the way that they approached comic books back then, I don't know the extent to which it's still true today, but at least back then, comic books were kind of like the low-budget sci-fi movies of the day. If you lived in Europe, like it wasn't. They were more like geared toward an adult audience. The art was more on the it was a lot of watercolor and pen art as well, and it was
not geared for children like the American comics, superhero comics.
Yeah, there was definitely a lot of like sex and violence in those comics that there was not in the Marvel DC ones, so that's kind of a different place there where it wasn't the same thing as where you have the the penciler and the inker and the person who does the flats and the colors, and each of those pieces are separate. It was one artist it was usually one artist who was either the writer and the illustrator, or they would have two people, and one was the writer and one was the illustrator. But then it was basically the same style of what I'm doing, where each page would be a painting, and so that's kind of different than what you would see with traditional comic art that people usually have. Is usually just the pen work,
the ink pages, right?
Yeah, and the ink pages. So that's something that I think is cool, and we'll find out what you think in January.
So were you influenced by people like Milo Manara and like Mobius and?
Definitely Mobius, Juan Jimenez. I pretty much had this same style growing up. I was always doing like watercolor with pen, and then when I saw some of those artists and how similar their style was and kind of what they were going for, I was like, this is my thing. And then so doing that, definitely like people like Mobius, Juan Jimenez are big influences. But I got to be honest, I don't like to say this, but I'm not much of a comic book guy. I don't really know a lot of the different people that were out there. I recognize a lot of the art. I love comic book art. I mean, I have a big stack of comic books at home, but I don't know tons of the comic book lore, I guess, of like.
Well, what's crazy is that heavy metal is actually taken over by Kevin Eastman, who's famous for being one of the people who started Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Interesting.
So, like, the second part of his career was becoming the editor and owner of Heavy Metal magazine.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of us were really influenced. Another big influence was someone like Frank Frazetta.
Yeah, definitely.
And like those people who had a real painterly style.
Mm-hmm.
And then for me, my dad's from Scotland, so I had a bunch of 2000 AD comics.
Oh yeah.
So the 2000 AD is where Judge Dredd comes from, and the same kind of thing. It was more of like a countercultural, like piece of art, and like a lot of the things about heavy metal too is like the stories were standalone. You could just pick it up and you would get like maybe it would be a piece of a story, or it would just be a short where it would start and end in one, like in like 8 or 9 pages.
Yeah, I guess for the audience, if they're not familiar with heavy metal, it was an anthology book. So a lot of times you would have either a chapter of a comic or or just a standalone piece. But yeah, that's kind of I guess that's really the school from where I come to comics from is sort of like a self-contained story, maybe no more than a dozen issues or something like that usually, and that kind of style. But yeah, that's kind of like you got me with some of the some of the different comic book artists, because a lot of times people ask about like, oh, this artist or that artist, and a lot of times I always feel bad because I'm kind of like, I don't know, I don't read that many comics, I don't know.
Well, when you're young, or if you don't live in a major city that's full of comic book shops, it's kind of hard to read the issues consecutively.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of us kind of longed to read comics and would have probably read more if we'd had the opportunity, but it was more like you would get that one issue and read it, and they'd always have that little asterisk that would say, see issue number 255.
Right. Oh,
like,
yeah, for what the
how
person's,
am I supposed to get
what the person's
255?
referencing.
And you're like, you want to follow the story, but it becomes such a chore. And that's why they have so many problems with having to reboot series, and it becomes like a mountain of knowledge that it's impossible to read all the books.
Well, I guess that's actually, so what I like to do, like the way I read comics is I'll go to the comic book store, I'll go to the bookstore, and I'll go through that bin of the $1 comics or 25-cent comics and pick out some ones that look interesting, and then I'll read through them, and then if I find there's a handful of them that I found are like, I'm like, this is really cool, I really like this, and then I'll get the graphic novel of that. And so that's kind of what I tried to do with this is, hopefully this will be one of those ones where if someone picks it up there, they'll be like, whoa, what is this? This is different, this is cool, and I want to read it. So fingers crossed, we'll see.
Okay, and then just to circle back before we wrap up, January 2023 is going to be the joint show with the two of us plus Harley. It's going to have original artwork that you can buy if you're a collector. You definitely want to check it out. But also, if you're just someone who wants to read the comic, you can always pick up a copy of these issues.
We're going to be having my comics and Mungo's comics from the Mungoverse. Days of the Week. It's just going to be Days of the Week Chapter 1. Is that what we got there?
Yeah.
The preview?
Yeah. So we're going to have original paintings by me as well, and then Harley's going to have a bunch of his original artwork. So people can pick up a book, they can check out the original art. It's pretty cool because Epitome Gallery kind of leans towards the street art. There's a lot of graph writers who come through there because they've got all the cans for sale. But every month is a different featured artist, so we're pretty lucky to kind of be invited and do a comic book art show. I think it's perfect opportunity to actually put comic book original art up on display. I think that's where it belongs. Like every single one of these pages is a work of art.
I completely agree. I think what the Epitome is doing is really cool. I think they're connecting with people that are doing, kind of like that pop art. Not necessarily they're not in the rarefied air of like the weirdo art world where it's like the pretentious abstract performance stuff, or where it's like, and if that's your thing, don't that's fine.
You don't like snobby art?
You know what I mean? Where it's like a styrofoam cup that's stapled to the wall, and it's $300,000 million because it's like you wouldn't get it. So I like that's that it's accessible, because I think that's a big part of what I like about art is you want it to be accessible, and between the the graffiti stuff and comics and some of the different art that they've had there, it's kind of like, I think it's got a cool pop art kind of a thing going there, where it's, I don't know exactly what
I think that's the
term
best
for that is.
Yeah, I mean, for the lack of a better word, I mean, you think of the original pop art like Andy Warhol. We're going back to the 60s and 70s, and I think we're kind of going through, we're already postmodern at this point, so it's hard to say where you pigeonhole it. Some people use a term called lowbrow when it's kind of outside of the mainstream. I'm comfortable with kind of commercial art and the commercial art aesthetic.
I think that's maybe what we're talking about. It's a little more commercial, a little more, it's accessible.
I think it's on the entertainment side of art, which if you look, like, I'm someone who loves concept art. I love character design. I love all of the materials that go into creating animation and video games, and I love the art every step of the way. Yeah. And for me, it's like, I'm really into narrative stuff and storytelling and representational art.
Right, it's like, it doesn't matter if that was just a sketch that someone made for an idea for a set for the new Avatar movie. It's still a really cool piece of art, even if it's not,
Well, like, but you want to get into the deep conceptual side of it. I think that anything that's like touched and crafted by a human hand does tell a story just by the fact that someone pick up the brush. So even if it's just like paint splattered on the wall, you feel that energy and you know that someone threw it. Right. There's this interplay between the art and the medium. So like I can dig both sides of it.
We're getting deep here.
Yeah, I can dig both sides.
Is that your audience prepared for this conversation?
Yeah, so I don't think that there's a proper term, but I think I embrace cartooning as an art form as well, and I think that comic books are just like a great example of a special type of medium.
Yeah.
You touched upon it. There's something special about the constraints.
And we were talking about that the other day, actually, that you were mentioning. It's like a lot of times what you have, even in, a lot of what you have in comic books is basically people doing the same steps that you would in a, super like photorealistic painting, or a painting or a sketch, or like a charcoal, thing like that. They're using the same techniques, just kind of truncated down so that you can put hundreds of paintings together in a book that you can read. And there's, I think there's something to be said for that. It's great practice for sure for painting.
Yeah.
If there are any painters out there, make a comic, and that's actually another big reason why I kind of got into it, was that it's great practice for painting because you're doing, hundreds of little paintings instead of trying to get all geared up and do one giant one that's got to be perfect. So.
Oh, well, I should just touch upon that a little bit. I think if you take just any one of these panels and think of it as a canvas, that's why I really like the name Out of Sequence, because I think you could look at any single page from this whole story and it's a standalone piece of artwork. So that's kind of what gave me the idea that we should call the show Out of Sequence.
Right.
Because another snobby way to talk about comics is sequential art. So if you're really fancy, you're collecting a piece of sequential art.
But it's just out of sequence.
Yeah.
I like that. Yeah, that's good.
So we could go on, and I think we'll have to have you back in the shop, and we'll keep the Humboldt County comic book community coming to you live from the Shadow Gallery. I say live, but I mean we're here. We're live. We're going to record this and make it available for future reference, and it really is making history. I think that I want to look back at this January 2023 and the show that we're putting together and think that was the start of something brand new, something huge, something different for the town. And we really support we appreciate any support. We support you supporting arts in the community. Any final words before we pull the plug on this?
Come to the show. You want to come down and support your friendly neighborhood comic book artists. And also come down to the Shadow Gallery. This place is great. They got comic books, video rentals, video games, which I don't know if you can see those, but there's a bunch of video games over here.
Talk about
it's awesome.
Pop culture and like the whole ephemera of all the thing. Great, guys.
We're starting there's a whole scene here, man. The whole pop culture scene. It's the zeitgeist. Okay. Bye, everybody.
Peace.